I have had a lifelong struggle with depression and anxiety and had sought many, many treatments over the years, a variety of
This is Steve
prescription
McFarlane.
medication.
He's 45, lives in the Chicago area, and in his battle with depression, he says that nothing worked.
I've tried so many different medications. I am talking dozens of medications over the past 20 years. I've gone through CBT and DBT and ACT and all of that. And I wanted something more and came across ketamine therapy in 2022.
Ketamine. It's a powerful anesthetic that can also help people with anxiety and depression. Steve did some research, talked to some friends about it, and decided to give it a try. He made an appointment with a telehealth company called MindBloom, which first connected us with Steve in 2022. In an interview this week, Steve remembered taking the drug for the first time.
The first session I had tremendous insights and began to see some things that got pieced together earlier in my life, the unhelpful patterns of thinking and action that I had developed. And right away, this is so transformative, but at the same time, so intense. I have always treated it as for lack of a better word, kind of sacred because of the power it has given me, for the way it's empowered me to overcome a lot of my depression and anxiety.
And ketamine's been around for a while. It was used during the Vietnam War as a battlefield anesthetic. It's also a party drug, sometimes called Special K. But its other uses have come into the spotlight more recently. Tech CEO Elon Musk has talked about having a prescription for ketamine to treat depression. But the drug is also under scrutiny after the high-profile death of Friends actor Matthew Perry. Perry died last year after he struggled with addiction and abused ketamine.
Actor Matthew Perry has died.
The Friends star who famously played Chandler Bing, passing away at 54 years old.
The 54-year-old actor was found in a hot tub at his home in Los Angeles. He'd taken the drug ketamine.
This month, 5 people were charged with causing his fatal overdose. Steve McFarlane has continued to take ketamine. When he heard about Perry's death, he became worried about the drug's future.
I loved Matthew Perry. Hilarious guy, great actor. And it's really sad, especially knowing how much he had struggled. Also, though, I was very mindful of the fact that this could change the reputation of a medication that can be really, really helpful. And I know there are a million people who could benefit from therapeutic ketamine use.
Getting access to ketamine legally has never been easier. And that may be a really good thing for many people. Certainly someone like Steve is someone who thinks that this has been life-changing for him. But conceivably, not everyone is going to have that effect. Not everyone's going to respond to it in the same way.
Daniel Gilbert covers the business of medicine for The Post. He's followed the rise in popularity of ketamine and concerns around it.
It's well known that ketamine can be a drug of abuse, and it can be dangerous, and people can become addicted to it. And Matthew Perry's tragic addiction and death could bring more scrutiny to it.
And now Daniel says the way people access ketamine could all change. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Thursday, August 29th. Today, I talk with Daniel about how ketamine usage has exploded in the last few years and whether the U.S. government will step in. Daniel, before we talk any more about this, can you actually just step back and tell me what exactly is ketamine? What is its intended usage and how effective is it as a drug?
So ketamine is a drug that works by basically blocking this messenger chemical in the brain that facilitates communication among neurons. And the effect that it has is it produces anesthesia. It relieves the body from feeling pain. The official approved use is as an anesthetic, but it's also been pretty well known over the years as a party drug. And it is still something that is used and abused recreationally.
But then I feel like I've also been hearing people use it not, in a hospital. So when you say anesthesia or anesthetic, I think, oh, I'm in a hospital, I've had surgery or something. But the idea that you could be at home taking a drug like this, how are people using it now?
It is an anesthetic. That is what the FDA has approved it for. But because it is an FDA-approved drug, physicians are able to prescribe it for other conditions as well in what is called off-label prescribing.
Wait, that's allowed?
Yeah, it's allowed, and it's actually pretty common generally across prescription drugs. There is the FDA-approved use, and it is still commonly used in surgical procedures in hospitals. But what it's really become popular for and developed quite a following is for its use as a quick-acting antidepressant. And there has been quite a lot of serious scientific research over the years that shows that ketamine can be a powerful antidepressant. And so on the basis of that research, even though the FDA has not reviewed this for treating anxiety or depression, but the research has been so promising, and because the drug has already been approved by the FDA for another purpose as anesthesia, that doctors, quite a number of doctors and companies have decided that this is something that is a legitimate therapy for depression.
That reminds me a little bit of Ozempic, which is a popular weight loss drug that initially was developed for an entirely different use.
Right, same concept. Ozempic, diabetes drug, approved for the FDA to treat diabetes, but for quite a while prescribed for weight loss, even though the label for Ozempic does not endorse treating weight loss.
So when it comes to ketamine, do we know how widespread its usage is outside of, a hospital setting, post-surgery, instead for this other use for mental health, the off-label use?
It's kind of hard to tell. By its nature, off-label uses can be tricky to track. So we don't have data from medical claims about how common it is. But there are studies out there that have more than 10,000 participants in them who are taking ketamine. So I think we can conservatively say that tens of thousands of Americans have taken ketamine, probably in the hundreds of thousands and quite possibly significantly more.
I think maybe a lot of people, the idea of ketamine being used in this manner, maybe it got on people's radars after the death of Matthew Perry, the Friends actor. And we're going to talk more a little bit about the particulars of what happened with him. But I'm wondering how its use became more widespread. Why is it that it seems like more people are taking this in this manner than, in a traditional hospital setting?
Well, to begin with, it's cheap, right? It's ketamine is off patent, so it's available generically and it can be made and sold cheaply.
Oh, so even if your insurance doesn't cover it, it might still be relatively affordable.
Correct. Yeah, affordable is relative, but
yeah, of course.
But in terms of like the manufacturing of it, it's not a brand name drug. It's generic, and so the cost of production is low. And then there was a pretty significant shift that happened at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
What happened during the pandemic that created that shift?
Well, you may remember all of a sudden we all stopped to go anywhere in public, right?
For a lot of people, not everybody,
for a
yeah.
lot of people. And as a result, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, and the Department of Health and Human Services, they saw what was happening and they decided that telehealth could be something that would give people more flexibility for medical appointments. And up until this point, there's a law called the Ryan-Haight Act that requires doctors to meet patients in person before prescribing certain drugs that are tightly regulated by the DEA, ketamine among them. But what they did during the pandemic, the early days of the pandemic, was they waived that requirement so that doctors would not have to first see patients in person before prescribing one of these controlled substances. And so that made it possible for someone to get, say, a ketamine prescription just by telehealth, by just opening up their laptop, having a video consultation with a doctor that they had never seen before, maybe across the country, and they could get a prescription that way.
I mean, is there like an entire industry now because of this pandemic era waiver?
Yes, there is. One of the first doctors that I talked to was a physician named Scott Smith, practiced out of South Carolina, and learned that he had gotten himself licensed in almost every state in the country to be able to prescribe ketamine via telemedicine.
Oh, like that was his goal, almost like, I'm going to just be doing this?
That was his goal. He became
Wow.
a ketamine practitioner, and he basically built a national practice from his home in South Carolina. And so I learned that he was not the only one doing this. And in fact, there are quite a few companies that have launched with the same notion and considerably more resources.
I am wondering, though, about the possible dangers of using a drug that is not FDA approved for the use that it is being used for. What are some of the possible downsides of using ketamine for this?
Well, for one thing, this is there's a substantial amount of evidence that comes from using ketamine in a controlled setting, but we know much less about the effects of ketamine in the way that it's being provided to people at home without that same kind of medical supervision. One of the things that I reported on last week with my colleague Richard Sema was a case of a woman who had taken ketamine at home. It was one of these tablets that dissolve in the mouth, and she overdosed.
Oh my gosh.
And was taken to a hospital, and she was revived there. But at the hospital, the emergency room physicians found that the ketamine in her blood, the levels of ketamine, were kind of comparable to or even exceeding what people would have with anesthesia. And so there's a lot we don't know about it. But there are some things that we do, some dangers that are very well documented. Addiction is one. It's not on the level of, say, opioids, but it is a real issue, as the Matthew Perry case demonstrates, and there are others as well that have been less high profile. But we also know that kind of serial, long-term use of ketamine, a really abuse of it, can have effects on the brain and also the bladder that can really cause some, undesirable effects.
Daniel, I want to go back to Matthew Perry because, like I said, I think a lot of people started thinking about the downsides or the dangers after his death. What do we know about his usage? Was he taking it off-label? What are the relevant factors in his case? And where does everything stand with that?
Yeah, he was taking it off-label. And we know from federal authorities that he had pursued ketamine at an infusion clinic, which is a kind of conventional way of getting it off-label, and that at some point he decided that he wanted a higher dose, and the doctors at the infusion clinic where he was declined to provide him a higher dose. And Matthew Perry had been vocal about his struggles with addiction over the years. He wrote about it quite a bit in his memoir. So there was been some significant question about whether he was really a good candidate for ketamine in the first place. But he unfortunately did develop an addiction to it and found other means of procuring it. And the federal authorities, Justice Department, have charged 5 people now who they said have tried to take advantage of him and his addiction by illicitly selling him ketamine.
Does that include doctors?
It includes 2 doctors.
Wow. After the break, Daniel and I talk about the uncertain future of ketamine access. We'll be right back. Daniel, since Matthew Perry's death, I can only imagine that this high-profile death is prompting providers and patients to rethink ketamine use and its benefits and drawbacks. I know that we heard earlier from one such patient. But more broadly, how are providers and patients feeling about the future of this drug, and how are they weighing those benefits versus the potential consequences? Like, what is the future of this drug after such a high-profile death?
I think this kind of event, Matthew Perry's death, is not really a shock to them. It's not a revelation. It is kind of a black eye. And it's something that draws a lot of public attention, as you said. Like, a lot of people are going to be learning about this for the first time, and that's the way they're being introduced to it is through this really dark and sad event. And so whenever that happens, there's always the potential for government officials looking at, is there something more that we should be doing here?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the government's role in all this and where things stand. What does it mean that the FDA is so cautious to approve the use of ketamine for mental health treatment, especially if there are so many doctors who are prescribing it for depression? And, you've spoken with patients who said this has helped them. What do you make of that?
One of the signature features of ketamine and the way that it's caught on is that it is off patent, it's generic. And so as a result, there's really no incentive for a pharmaceutical company to conduct the kind of rigorous, expensive trials and spend, millions or hundreds of millions of dollars that it takes to demonstrate that a drug is safe and effective and will meet the FDA's standards. It's incredibly time-consuming, incredibly expensive work to be able to submit a drug for FDA approval. And when you don't have the incentive of making a lot of money, it just doesn't happen. And so ketamine is in this place where it's available, but it's not approved by the FDA to treat depression, and it's just kind of in that holding pattern. So it's not something the FDA is going to act on. The FDA has, over the years, raised quite a few concerns about the use of ketamine to treat depression and pointed out that it has not approved it and that there is no approved dose that is known to be safe and effective and that there can be real downsides to it. And I think it's worth contrasting the way that ketamine is being prescribed today with a drug that the FDA has approved, which is a derivative of ketamine called S-ketamine. And it's a nasal spray that is marketed under the name Spravato. And the FDA approved this in 2019 to treat very severe depression. And so to get Spravato, you've got to physically go to a clinic and you have to be observed for at least 2 hours. So there is an extensive set of monitoring requirements for Spravato that is not at all in place for ketamine because it's not really under the supervision of the FDA when it's being used off-label in this way.
That's interesting to hear about this distinction between a drug that is approved for this usage and one like ketamine, which is not. So when it comes to ketamine, it sounds like the entities who really have the power here are individual doctors. They are the ones who are weighing the guidance about its usage in this way. But if they have a license and can prescribe medication, they can prescribe it. So they're the ones who have the power here, it sounds like.
That's exactly right.
So you had mentioned earlier how the DEA suspended this federal rule during the pandemic that allowed doctors to prescribe while, just via telehealth, which made it easier for people to get drugs like ketamine. It led to this proliferation of this drug. But the pandemic is not what it was before. We're not in it the way we were before. And how long is this temporary waiver going to last? Is there any move to make it permanent or to roll it back?
This, again, it's always fascinated me that this ketamine telehealth industry is built on this waiver that was supposed to be temporary, right? And yet here we are. It's 2024. We're way beyond the early days of the pandemic, and it's still in place. So what has happened is the DEA and Health and Human Services put together proposed a rule back in the spring of 2023 that would restore the in-person requirement for doctors to see patients before prescribing a a controlled substance like ketamine. But they have not yet finalized that rule. And in fact, they have now delayed that rule from coming into effect twice. And it's currently, the waiver will last at least through the end of 2024 as they kind of continue to work on the rule. I should say they got a ton of pushback.
Wait, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so they put this rule out that would restore some in-person requirements for a doctor to meet with a patient. And they got like more than 35,000 public comments in response to the rule, and many of them were against the rule. Many of them came from patients, they came from providers who have really come to value the flexibility of having telehealth and that being an option and not having to leave home. People have pointed out that it's particularly helpful or critical for people who live in rural areas, or for people who have low incomes or lack easy access to transportation to be able to access this from home. So there have been concerns about access. There have been concerns about the continuity of care for people who have already started taking these medications, maybe prescribed by a doctor who's in a state very far from them. And of course, the telehealth lobby itself has certainly flexed its muscle and pushed back against these kind of requirements.
Well, I'm wondering what happens if this temporary waiver is no longer in place, and where does that leave someone like Steve McFarland, who we heard from earlier?
Well, potentially in a more complicated place than he is today in terms of the logistics of being able to get this medication that he's come to rely on. And so at the moment, he's able to continue to get it through this telehealth service, MindBloom. But if there is a new rule that goes into effect and it restores the requirement for him and for everyone else who's taking a controlled substance like ketamine to meet with a doctor in person to continue that medication, it'll require some in-person encounter. And for someone in the Chicago area like Steve, that might not be insurmountable. But it remains to be seen exactly how that'll work out. And we really don't know exactly where the DEA and Health and Human Services are going to come down on the final rule. But assuming that he's able to continue to access ketamine, it's something that he now thinks of as an important tool to maintain his mental health and sees himself using this kind of indefinitely into the future.
I'm also a type 1 diabetic. I'm probably always going to need insulin and an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor. These technologies have come along to make me able to live my life in a way that I don't have that particular disease, type 1 diabetes. I think of my mental health and my brain in much the same way. There's something a little biologically off, probably. So I'm always going to need some sort of help. I do still take prescription medications for my mental health, and it's this whole ecosystem of care that is really helping me live a happy and fulfilled life. But it's not the ketamine that's keeping me happy and keeping me fulfilled. I needed ketamine to jumpstart my healing and growth process. I'm going to continue to need it, but to a much lesser extent, because there is something honestly flawed with the biological structure of my brain, my gut, whatever it may be.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me and explaining all of this.
Thanks for having me.
Daniel Gilbert covers the business of medicine for The Post. There's some other news I've been watching today that I wanted to tell you about. First, I don't know about you, but it seems every day someone I know has just come down with COVID-19, whether it's from sending kids back to school or just travel. Well, new coronavirus vaccines are starting to arrive at pharmacies and doctors' offices. This is after the FDA approved new shots from Pfizer and Moderna last week. I just got an alert from my pharmacy urging me to make an appointment. But many Americans with no health insurance will now have to pay out of pocket for the shots. This is after a federal program that covers vaccine costs lost funding. And then, if you're also feeling a void in your life since the Paris Olympics ended, there's another big event that can scratch that itch for you. That's the sound of wheelchair rugby, also called murder ball. This is Team USA at a training camp in Birmingham, Alabama in May, getting ready for the Paralympics. The Paralympics are the third largest sports competition in the world. The Games started Wednesday in Paris with more than 4,000 elite athletes with disabilities competing until September 8th.
So wheelchair rugby is a full contact, high-speed sport, 4-on-4 played on a basketball court with the object of the game to get the ball from one end of the court to the other while other people are trying to knock you out of a chair and rip the ball out of your hands.
Sarah Adam is the first woman to make the U.S. wheelchair rugby team.
You know, the guys think that they're going to come in and they're going to hip into me and knock me over, and I hit them right back and put them on their face and kind of roll away like it was nothing.
Team USA used to dominate wheelchair rugby, but hasn't taken home the gold since 2008. They're hoping to change that this year.
Obviously a little bit nervous about how things are going to play out in Paris, but I think in those moments you trust your training, you trust your preparation, you trust your teammates, and you look them in the eye and you're like, we've got this. And then as soon as that whistle blows, you know, it's just rugby.
That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show, please subscribe to The Washington Post. Not only is it a great way to help us continue to do this work, but now you can get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Just subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. Today's show was produced by Peter Bresnan, with help from Ali Bianco and Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks to Hadley Green. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.